Hello, everybody. My name is Ruhan, and I'm an international student studying the IB diploma program, and I'm planning to apply to US universities and various other countries. And because I'm planning to apply, I decided to give the SAT. As you probably would have seen in the title and the thumbnail, I scored a 1520 in the SAT with a 790 math score and a 730 English reading and writing combined score. And that places me in the 99th percentile of the test takers, which took the test with me. Now, throughout this video, I aim to basically dissect what my method was and what my process was, which I found to be somewhat different from various other people across the internet. And I feel like a lot of you might be concerned whether this is applicable to only the paper version or have I updated it for the digital version. I just want to clarify that I personally scored a 1520 in the paper test, and I don't really plan to take it again. However, the tips I'm about to give, and my study routine can basically be replicated for any form of test, and it should work pretty well. The most common advice I see people give on the internet is that the SAT is simply about taking practice tests. Now, I'm not saying that taking practice tests does not help, but I personally found that more than practice tests and studying quote unquote for the test, like most people recommend, that studying the content of the test is much more helpful. I believe practice tests should be used, however, they should be used reasonably and not wasted. What I mean by that is take your first practice test without any preparation to just gauge what your level is at. Now, someone who's at like already a 14, 1500 level would need to prepare very differently from someone who's at like a 11, 1200. Now, I'm not saying it's harder to improve. I'm just saying the preparation regimes would be different. Second of all, take that SAT score and plan out some form of content-based study for like a month or two. And this would include learning mathematical concepts, learning grammar rules which you are not aware of. And for reading, it just simply revolves around improving your vocabulary and just being able to understand the type of content being asked in the SAT. My next overall to do would be to use various different resources for preparation. Now, note this is for the paper SAT. However, the similar concept can be really easily applied to the digital SAT. For me personally, I used a lot of practice tests and I basically downloaded all of the College Board practice tests and took them on paper. I also used various different books for the content. Now, remember, you don't really want to study for the test, you want to study for what you do not know. And my math was initially pretty strong, but still I bought like the College Panda SAT math book, mainly for practice questions because I heard it has pretty challenging questions. And it does go into a bit more depth about some topics. However, I'll expand on the SAT math section in a later part. I also bought like Erica L. Meltzer, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing the name wrong, English SAT reading book. Now, English SAT reading for me personally has always really been about practicing to read rather than applying any strategies. I personally bought this book because it just comes with a lot of passages and you just learn by doing. Last but not least, the section I struggled with the most, which was the SAT grammar, because I did not know grammar rules and basically spoke English how it felt. And this book I actually really enjoyed because it, more than teaching you about the SAT, it teaches you about various grammatical concepts. And this is a book that I still really appreciate to this day. And because I do some writing myself, I still reference this book for like my IB courses where I'm trying to write something which is more grammatically correct than I would otherwise do. And these were basically my physical learning resources. Apart from this, Khan Academy is a great free resource. And one another resource I would really recommend is get a Reddit account and go on r/SAT because the community is amazing. They would help you explain questions. There are people with various ranges of scores. There's like perfect 1600 scores, and you can really learn a lot if you delve deep into the community. Next advice, time is key. I've seen a lot of people basically practice for the SAT based on sections, and they divide their time very leniently, where they would give themselves like half an hour for reading and answering a question on an SAT passage. Now, you could get 100% by taking half an hour reading basically any one-page text. But the important thing is acclimatizing yourself with being able to read a whole SAT passage in about 5 minutes or so. Still adapting your mind to be able to understand and absorb the important pieces of information while reading it really quickly is an important skill to have, and time management is key. The last advice, and this is something which really helped me, was an error log. Now, some people might already know this, but Basically, a very good way for preparing for the SAT is, okay, I've done this practice test, right? I have like maybe 15 to even 20 mistakes. What I personally did, made a Google Sheets where I created various different categories in which I highlighted, okay, what test it was, what type of, which subject was the question from, which I got wrong, what was the correct answer, why the correct answer was the correct answer, and why I think I got that wrong in time. Now, as you can see in the Google Sheet, there are about 90 plus entries. So that can tell you that I did a lot of practice questions and I was meticulous with why I was getting stuff wrong and how I could really improve and get things right the next time around. And don't just make this sheet, analyze it. Like normally I would see that, in Google Sheets, you can very easily get access to various different types of data. And I could see that, okay, most of my mistakes came in the English writing section and they were related to the punctuation rules of commas and independence and dependent clauses. And therefore, I knew for the next week or two what I really needed to focus on to make sure I know what I'm talking about when taking the SAT. Next up is the math section. Now, one of the most important things I want people to know is that SAT math is not meant to be challenging. It's meant to be tricky. Now, if you really take your time and stop thinking about the SAT and just think about concepts as independent grade 10 subjects like algebra, geometry, pre-calculus in the form of functions, and just some basic probability knowledge and really basic complex numbers. You just really need to know the theory of those concepts really well. So when you get a really long-winded and comprehension-based math question, you can take your time, understand the question, and then apply your skills to solving that question. The last two advices I would give you would be number one, don't abuse your calculator because to a certain point I've seen a lot of students which realize that they can take a graphic calculator into the test. They really rely on that graphic calculator for graphic questions or inequality questions. However, I find that if you don't really understand the concept, just being able to graph a function won't really do much. That's why I would recommend people to, when they're practicing, minimize the use of the calculator. Only use it when you need it and only use it for computational purposes. Really understanding the content of the topics will really help you gauge what type of question it is and solve it quickly rather than just punching buttons on a calculator. Last but not least, improve your English proficiency because it is an SAT math test. However, especially questions related to statistics, related to probability, even algebra questions might ask you to calculate something very different from your classic calculate X in middle school or high school. And being able to extract detailed and important information from a question becomes an incredibly important skill when you're talking about that difference between like a 750 and an 800. Now, moving on to the English reading and writing sections. SAT reading really does not have much to talk about. The simple fact is that you just really need to be able to read well to be able to score well on the SAT. However, there are different forms of reading. Like I personally am a very detail-based reader where I would spend a lot of time on like a page of a book where I'm not understanding one sentence rather than continuing on and getting a general bigger picture of the text. I really had to unprogram my mind to not do that during the SAT because again, time is key. You only have about 13 minutes for each and every passage on average, and I would recommend setting yourself a time of 10 minutes for each passage to both read the passage and then answer the questions. And when reading the passage, make sure that more than the details, you should focus on the bigger picture because as long as you know the bigger picture, when you go on to the question, you can extract the detail very easily from the text if you know the passage really well. Next piece of advice would be to trust your instinct. What I found is that a lot of the times when I get my English reading questions wrong is because I'm overthinking the questions. Generally, the SAT questions are, again, not meant to be challenging, they're meant to be tricky. And you have to start to identify extreme words such as always, never, and focus on the small details of the answer to eliminate them before choosing an answer. You see, in the SAT, it's not really about you finding the right answer, but it's about you being able to identify the wrong answers. And that really works well for an English reading test because sometimes the answers are so similar, but there are these tiny discrepancies which you can use to like eliminate almost always two of the four responses. The last tip I would like to give you for the SAT reading is read once and read it well. Now, rather than some people taking like 2 or 3 minutes to skim over a full SAT passage and then focusing on the question, keep going back to check the references, is generally, I find, not a good idea because you never really understand what the passage is fully about. Rather, I would say spend like 5 minutes of your 10 minutes just reading the passage and reading it well. Again, you can skim over the extraneous parts of the article, but if you really want to get down, take 5 minutes, read the full thing and read it well. And you'll realize that when you go to the questions, a lot of the times the answers just simply are just a look away. Now, moving on to English writing. Number one, shorter is better. As you probably would have seen, SAT writing passages generally revolve around finding the most suitable or the best substitute for some underlined sections of the passage. Generally speaking, when you're writing in any tone whatsoever, verbose is definitely not the right way to go. And if you're seeing various different answers where one answer can convey everything the other answers are trying to say, but it reduces repetition, it reduces the amount of words used, and it brings everything back down to its basic bare bones level, that is probably your right answer. Tip number two, always read aloud the answers in your head. You have an underlined section, you have various answers you want to fit in, you maybe have eliminated one or two possibilities, but you were really unsure. Read it in your mind and don't make it sound like it's right. Make it sound like it's wrong so you're mentally always looking for problems and mishaps. And generally speaking, you'll end up with the correct answer most times. Tip number three, read the full passage. The biggest trap I've seen people fall into is the fact that they panic when they realize they only have 35 minutes to answer 44 questions. Therefore, they have less than a minute every question, so they can't afford to read the full passage. But a lot of the times, the context that the passage provides is key. And rather than rereading the same lines again and again, reading the whole passage and then answering the questions in order is a much better tactic. And you can generally read like a whole passage in like 5 to 10 minutes. And considering that there are only 4 passages, if you can average somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes of reading, which is generally a lot of time for the length of passages in SAT writing, you could easily finish your SAT writing and you would feel much less stressed. You would be much more certain with your responses and you would be judging the answers based on the merit of the whole passage rather than the 2 lines you are reading again and again, trying to search for the right option. Now, English, when you're speaking like any other language, is very different from the type of English you need to use when doing formal and grammatically correct writing. That is why learn your grammar rules, especially the punctuation. Where to use a comma, what is a comma splice, what is a run-on sentence. Last but not least, if I could boil down my improvement in SAT writing to one thing, is the understanding of independent, dependent, and non-essential clauses. And you can basically build out everything from there, identifying what is a sentence, like an independent clause, what is a dependent clause, and what type of punctuation you use to connect these things is basically how you end up writing an article, an essay, whatever type of English writing. So really understanding the difference between the 3 types of clauses is, in my opinion, the biggest step you will take to improving that SAT writing score. I hope I helped you with your SAT journey. I hope rather than giving you specific advice, because there are tons of sources you can get that from, but really set you on a path to success and on a path to where you can focus on several things to improve your SAT and basically maximize your chances for a good college. Now note, I did take the SAT 2 times. The first time I scored about a 1490. I just really wanted to break the 1500 barrier. So just a note, because I just don't want people to think that, oh, I got like a 1500 plus score in one time. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments down below. I'll be answering all of them. If you need any further advice on resources, I have provided various links in the description. So please read that. Thank you very much. I hope this helped.